Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
The path between houses. Some nights there is a lamp burning when the house next door is quiet, and other nights the branches blowing up against the seasoned clapboards seem to shake the light to numbness. It is unremarkable, this scratchiness where bare branches open and close a path worn down almost to a habit.
Welcome to Northern Lights. I'm speaking today with Sheila Coghill and Thom Tammaro, who have edited a collection called Visiting Emily. It was the winner that was the 2001 Minnesota Book Award winner for Anthologies and Collections. Welcome, Sheila and Thom. I wonder if you could. This is a wonderful book. I really enjoyed. I enjoyed visiting with Emily. I love the title in the sense that she's still alive as a presence. I wonder if you could explore the idea behind the book and how the genesis of this book.
Sure. In 1986, I was out at a conference in Lowell, Massachusetts, and I had some extra time, and I did a dead writer's grave pilgrimage.
Right.
Jack Kerouac in Lowell, and then to Concord for Thoreau and Emerson,
right,
and then out to Amherst for Emily Dickinson, and did that all in the course of a long afternoon. And when I was out visiting Emily, nobody was home. I couldn't get into the house, so I went to the cemetery and so on. It was a very powerful experience to be in the presence of Dickinson and being on her turf. And then about, I'm guessing about 11 years later, Sheila was on sabbatical, was working on a Dickinson project, and we went out to Amherst, and she was working at the Jones Library and the Frost Library at Amherst College with some manuscripts. And when she was working, doing archival work, I was over at the Jones Library talking with the curator, and I asked him about poems and so on, and we looked at a lot of work, and we had a lot of time, and Sheila and I talked about it, and in the meantime, we had been collecting poems that we saw cropping up in magazines and books by contemporary writers. And at some point, it dawned on us, anthology. There's just so much out there, so much work out there. And to me, it was also saying there's something more than just these are a lot of poems about Emily Dickinson.
Right.
It's really about contemporary poets paying homage to Dickinson. There's something about her, her presence that I think American writers have to confront at some time or another. Poets, when they commit themselves to being poets, I think at some point or another they have to come face to face with this presence.
Well, she's one of the master poets, as is Walt Whitman or Robert Frost, Sylvia Plath. To anybody who's really, as Thom said, truly committed to writing poetry, you have to see what those writers have done, and you have to learn from what they've done. And Emily Dickinson is, one of those writers that people come back to again and again and again.
Can we explore a little bit the attraction of Emily Dickinson as a figure? She's almost like an icon. A muse, a saint of literature almost. Can you explore her image is so multifaceted and glittering. It's sort of there's almost a glamour of it. It charms. So can you talk about the many aspects of her image to contemporary poets?
Well, I'll say a few things, and Thom can extrapolate from that. She does appeal to all different age levels. That's one thing. You can read her in grade school. You can read her in high school. You can come to her as an adult, maybe not even ever have had any of her poetry early on. and later again and again. I mean, you can come back and find something new each time. And her images are so startling in some of her poems that ultimately they are enigmatic and mysterious. And so people keep coming back to those to try to figure them out, know them. As somebody had once put it, people are always trying to unpack Emily Dickinson. But she has that kind of attraction on a lot of different levels. You know, sometimes just pure enjoyment, sometimes on really, you know, puzzling intellectual levels. And that's the range that she has. So it's not any just one sort of niche. It's many different levels. And I don't know, Tom, you have some thoughts about that too.
Yeah, I certainly feel the same way about. She's one of those poets that I think in America at least we encounter at all levels of our education. Frost probably is another one who works that way. Possibly Whitman. There's a wonderful collection called Emily Dickinson for Children, and it's what we consider her children's verse. And yet those poems operate on obviously more than just one level. They're very sophisticated poems. So we encounter her all through our educational profile, you know, our lives. This is a kind of a wild guess here, but to be honest with you, I think this haunting portrait has something to do with our fascination. We have one portrait of this. I take that back. We have a couple of portraits. They're painted portraits when she was much younger, 9 years old, and so on. And then we have a silhouette of her. But this daguerreotype that was done in either late 1846 or early 1847. That stare. She's 16 years old when this is taken, and you know she lives to be 52. She's in her early 50s when she dies.
But this is the image.
But this is the image that's fixed. It's frozen.
Anybody who's ever seen it.
And has been over time, from the time and of course the family didn't like the daguerreotype, and luckily it was salvaged from the maid of the family.
Whom she passed it on to.
She passed it on to. But there it is, and I think it's a very haunting, at one time haunting, but also inviting portrait. So I don't want to make too much of that, but I do think that there's a bit of that in there. Unlike the portraits of Whitman that we have all kinds, we even have Whitman's voice. We have a recording of Whitman's voice. We don't have Emily's voice. She's represented by this one photograph, and there's something haunting about that.
Whitman's cigar is only
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Whitman sampler. I have a cigar box at home with the Whitman sampler, of course.
Now, is it the reclusiveness, the privacy, the shyness, the timorousness, the absolute commitment, almost like a hermit, to her craft as a poet, that intrigues contemporary poets who tend to be so public and having to be so public? Do you think that there's an aspect of that extreme?
I think, that's really fascinating, especially for modern people who tend to, you know, for modern life is mostly an extroverted sort of phenomenon in any case. Yes. And Dickinson, I guess what we'd identify as her introversion, really was her commitment to her art. My theory is that she used her domestic sphere was her artist studio.
Yes, absolutely.
And particularly, I mean, if you had to literally or physically locate her bedroom. If you've ever visited the homestead in Amherst and visited the bedroom, that's where she created her poetry, wrote her poetry. What some people might find as, you know, a withdrawal from society, for her was, she didn't think of it as a withdrawal. She saw it largely as a way to navigate a lot of 19th century expectations and demands on women. And she decided, you know, she wasn't going to participate in a lot of those in the conventional sense. Not that she didn't enjoy certain domestic things. Obviously, she loved to bake bread and do other sorts of things. She loved to garden. But her main commitment, I mean, not participating in some things allowed her then to focus largely on her art, which is what she did. Now, maybe that is strange to a lot of modern people, because that kind of intensity of commitment people is not a normal phenomena in just everyday life, obviously. But she decided she was going to do that. So, and its singularity is very fascinating to people.
It is an extremely. I see her. I do agree with the bedroom. But I always see her as the baking of the bread.
Sure.
Is almost like the kneading of the poetry, and that there's a really as the sort of the alchemist's oven in which she's cooking up this pursuit of the philosopher's stone.
That's a good, yeah.
I really see that.
Yeah.
I really see her with her fingers covered in flour when I think of that. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Sheila's
Someplace in one of
working
her letters
on a critical book on Dickinson,
those kind of
Emily
images.
Dickinson as natural alchemist, and so
Yes,
I was just
I would
thinking
agree.
about
I would agree with that.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
She talks about in one of her letters, and because you brought it up, I didn't have it in my head, but I can paraphrase it, where she talks about making the bread and thinking about lines from her poems.
Right.
And of course, the way she turns the phrase, the line in the letter itself is poetic.
Right.
As if there is no division between making the bread and making the poem. That each act of making itself is an act of producing something artistic.
Right.
One of the writers in Visiting Emily, writer by the poet and anthologist by the name of Annie Finch, has a poem called A Letter for Emily Dickinson, in which she takes that moment of bread making and becomes a central metaphor for the poem. And it begins with, it says, "Like me, you used to write while baking bread, propping a sheet of paper by the bins of salt and flour, so if your kneading led to words, you'd take them, looping their thin shins in your black writing as they sang to be free." And so she's picking up on that I think,
that image.
your sense of the bread making and the poetry making too.
Can we talk a little bit about how there's various sort of elements emerge in this collection I think it's 80 poems, is that right?
About 78.
78
yeah,
poems. 78
and,
responses by
78 poets. Right.
by contemporary poets. And that some of them approach I think going back to the idea that Sheila talked about of the thing about Dickinson is, as teachers or educators, we try and unpack her, we try and parcel her. And the great thing about her is she is a stone that can't be any more polished than she's already polished herself. You have to meet her as she is. And one of the things there are many different ways that the contemporary poets approach her, but one of the things that fascinated me was the way some of the poets try and change her into something that is like a contemporary poet. That some of them can't let her be this mysterious figure who wore the white dresses and was reclusive.
Yes.
Can you talk about that urge to modernize, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, modernize Emily?
Well, one of the things that we discovered, and we suspected this for a while, was that everybody wants to make Emily Dickinson their own.
Right.
They want to personalize her.
Right.
Some people want to possess her. And then there are people, of course, who want to totally transform her.
Right.
And I don't know, Tom, you had a particular poem in mind where you wanted to sort of demonstrate that with?
Well, partly, I think one of the reasons why there's an attempt to make her a contemporary, because I think she speaks so much as a contemporary.
Right, she's very modern, yes.
And if you go back and read her work against the backdrop of 19th century, a lot of 19th century verse,
right.
She's not sentimental in that.
Right,
she doesn't fit.
Right.
You know,
she expresses sentiment, but without the
sentimentality. And so consequently, I think a lot of people feel Emily Dickinson as a contemporary.
Yeah.
Maxine Kumin has a poem in here that does that, and I think wonderfully called After the Poetry Reading, and she transplants Emily into the 1990s and says, if Emily Dickinson lived in the 1990s and let herself have sex appeal, she'd grow her hair wild and eccentric down to her buttocks, you said. She'd wear magenta tights, black ankle boots, and tiny pointed paddock boots, kind of turning her into kind of a punk figure there.
Yes.
So
punk girl.
Yeah. And partly I think it's the desire to see how or to imagine how she would converge with this contemporary culture that we live in, because she was such a genius.
Yes, and whether she'd reject contemporary culture the way she rejected her own contemporary culture, or she would somehow find a way to navigate our culture in the same way she navigated her own culture, and still have that same commitment for poetry. You know, and how would she manage to do that? So people do want to modernize her that way.
Some of the poets in the collection, they directly, in my eyes anyway, they directly meet her uniqueness. They kind of directly meet it, and they acknowledge it. Like I'm thinking of John Berryman's poem, in which he sums it up in 2 words.
Sure.
hot diggity.
Yeah.
He says, you know, your poems are, your poetry is alive, hot diggity. And it's like that sense of looking for a poet, you know, contemporary poets looking for somebody who they can really, you know, they can sort of, you know, bow towards and say, you know, she is it. Can you talk about that element of, as you spoke about, Thom, the homage, the sense of being inspired by Emily?
I think there's a sense of
categories
the sort of monolithic presence of Dickinson. Again, I think when you come into, if you're looking chronologically or thematically or historically at American poetry, Dickinson's presence is there, it's felt.
Right.
And I think at some point writers will take her on in a number, as you say, in a number of different ways, through parody, through homage, through
Satire.
pilgrimage, through satire, through irreverence, and so on and so forth. And so I think there is that sensibility of trying to get to this person and bring her into our own contemporary world to see how she resonates with this contemporary world, because she is forward thinking.
Right.
And you know, and to be honest with you, there's a sense of we really don't have Dickinson's work presented to us, and really in terms of the Johnson edition and so on, until the 1950s. Right. And so in some ways, she comes to us as a contemporary poet. Her poetry comes to us rather late from her own life. And so there's a generation of people, you know, the 50s and 60s reading Dickinson really for the first time. And I think that's another thing to help us think about her presence here in the 21st century.
Yeah. And one of the people who really, well, there are several, who make Emily Dickinson, I don't know, palpable to the contemporary imagination, of course, is Adrienne Rich. In her sort of landmark essay, you know, Vesuvius at Home, just to quote, you know, that image from Dickinson, sort of makes Dickinson explode into our own imaginations, and so then people actually begin to really focus on her poetry, the restored edition of it from Johnson, without the edited punctuation, without the rhymes that are made regular, without the words that are corrected or you know, revised by earlier editors. So she becomes much more real to us on the one hand, and on the other hand, fascinating, and then ultimately so mysterious, because there's always that one element you can't know about Emily Dickinson. And the one element is different for each person who reads her every single time. When I do a seminar on Whitman and Dickinson, one of many essays that I have my students read is an essay by Adrienne Rich, the famous essay in 1975 called Vesuvius at Home. Adrienne Rich is one of the first literary critics to bring Emily Dickinson into what you'd call a contemporary imagination, sort of fueled the new interest in Emily Dickinson studies. We have one of her poems in here, and she uses a phrase, half-cracked, which is a phrase that, and she also refers to Higginson, who was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was one of Emily Dickinson's editors, and whom she just, you know, talked with during her life, but he never got Emily Dickinson. He wanted to correct all of her rhymes and her punctuation. And the phrase half-cracked is a phrase that is actually, that he writes in a letter back to his own wife and saying, you know, I've met the half-cracked poetess of Amherst. Anyway, the poem is, I am in danger, sir. Half-cracked to Higginson, living afterward famous in garbled versions, your hoard of dazzling scraps, a battlefield. Now your old snood, mothballed at Harvard, and you in your verorium moment, equivocal to the end. Who are you? Gardening the daylily, wiping the wineglass stems, your thought pulsed on behind a forehead battered, paper thin. You, woman, masculine in single-mindedness, for whom the word was more than a symptom, a condition of being, till the air, buzzing with spoiled language, sang in your ears of perjury. And in your half-cracked way, you chose silence for entertainment, chose to have it out at last on your own premises.
Can we talk about the approaches? Another approach to Emily Dickinson is the humor. Thom, you did mention, and there's some wonderful humor in in refusing to make her into an icon and refusing to make her into this saintly, reclusive mystic in tune with her bread and her garden, etc. You talk about the elements of parody and the elements of humor in your collection.
Well, she was witty herself.
Yes.
She loved a
Yes.
witty phrase and a
Yes.
turn of a pun, and she has
Yes.
some really satirical kinds of poems. And so people see that in her and, either see the absurdity of, trying to be a poet in the modern world, and then, they can identify with that, or her own sense of that there was an element of the absurd in what she was doing herself, besides the fact that she just liked a good joke, that sort of thing. But yeah, we have a whole category of poems. The book itself is arranged alphabetically by author, but we do have several poems that sort of play into her whimsical sense, her sense of wit, which could either be, sometimes it fell flat, but sometimes it's extremely sharp. So we have several poems in there that do that. For example, one of the poems, there's one called Emily Dickinson's To-Do List by Andrea Carlisle. Monday, figure out what to wear. White dress, put hair in bun, bake gingerbread for Sue, peer out window at passerby, write poem, hide poem. Tuesday, white dress, off-white dress, feed cats, chat with Lavinia, work in garden, write TWH. Wednesday, white dress or what? Eavesdrop on visitors from behind door, write poem, hide poem. Thursday, try on new white dress. Gardening, watch out for narrow fellow in the grass. Gingerbread, cakes, treats, poems, write them and hide them. Friday, embroider sash for white dress, write poetry, water flowers on windowsill, hide everything.
There is one poet who I myself, her poem is Patricia Ikeda's poem For Emily Dickinson. And I myself, it nearly knocked me out of my chair when I read it, because I was reading these various reactions, but I thought, she has caught the electricity of Dickinson and has allowed that to inspire her. And I wonder if
Tom,
you wouldn't mind reading that.
Okay, Patricia Ikeda lives in San Francisco and wrote this actually when she was an undergraduate at Oberlin College, and it's published in a little chapbook of hers, called For Emily Dickinson. And it goes like this. It's a prose poem. She being too much for life, the rare person with no need to travel. The countries split their horizons. The space inside her felt like death. Always a struggle between hunger and surfeit. Who could have taken a world so charged out on a walk? The explosion of a chestnut tree, the eye blazes blossoms. Her plain, straightforward face, I imagine long skirts, tight-laced boots. Who would think of her as inebriate of air, debauchee of dew? She knew the pure high of being. She kept it all her life. What consciousness and the imagination circumscribe is all we need, more than enough. She stands by the cupboard, putting cups away. She holds the cup in two hands, looking down into it as if reading minuscule script printed around the rim. She stands on tiptoe, reaching for the shelf above her head, and gives the cup a little push forward. The cup falls. She slowly leans down, brushes aside the slivers of china, picks up the handle, turns it in the light. The snow is falling. She is watching. A fresh, cool pear on a small plate. She picks up the little silver fruit knife, puts it down, takes a large bite. She holds the juice in her mouth, swallows and looks around laughing. She writes her brother, Austin, "You must have pears." She did not burn for them before she died. She did not leave any note to explain their existence. She knew there was a need for them. She felt within herself the amazing vector of eternity and knew it was her own force. Her last letter, little cousins called back, Emily.
And again, because reference there in that poem to, of course, her poetry that was found in a box by her sister several weeks after she died. And again, that amazing vector of eternity, I think, is for me anyway, the great attraction of Emily Dickinson to the contemporary world. And it is my sad duty to wrap up today our conversation with Sheila Coghill, Thom Tammaro, and their wonderful book, Visiting Emily Dickinson. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Visiting Emily, Poems Inspired by the Life of Emily Dickinson is a book that has 78 poets, each writing his or her own response over the years to Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson's presence in American poetry is monolithic, and I think any writer who attempts to commit him or herself to the writing life of poetry has to take on that presence at some time or another, which is why there are so many poems in the book, so many writers out there, going as far back as Hart Crane in 1926 and 27, and moving forward into the contemporary period. So Emily's presence is deep and wide in American poetry. I like to read a short poem here that kind of brings Emily Dickinson into the contemporary world. It's a short piece by X.J. Kennedy called Emily Dickinson Leaves a Message to the World Now That Her Homestead in Amherst Has an Answering Machine. Because I could not stop for breath past altitudes of earth, upon a reel of tape I leave directions to my hearth. For all who will not let me lie unruffled and escape, speak quickly, or I'll intercept your message with a beep. Though often I had dialed and rung the bastion of the bee, the answer I had hungered for was seldom home to me.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.